So we begin in Beijing, where US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has been meeting Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang at the start of 2 days of official talks. Blinken's visit to China is the first by an American diplomat in almost 5 years and comes as the world's two largest economies look to ease strained relations. Our correspondent Dong Shui reports.
Blinken has finally set foot in Beijing amid tensions between China and the United States. But whether he will land a meeting with the Chinese President Xi Jinping, that remains to be seen. We know that the Biden administration has looked to restart high-level communications with China since the two leaders had met on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Bali last year. But prior to the trip being announced, Blinken spoke with China's Foreign Minister Qin Gang on the phone. During that conversation, Qin stressed the U.S. needs to respect China's concerns, stop interfering in China's internal affairs, and undermining its sovereignty, security, and developmental interests in the name of competition. Well, meanwhile, the Assistant U.S. Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, Daniel Crittenbrigg, said he doesn't expect Blinken's visit to produce what he described as a long list of deliverables, but he did suggest that it offers a critical moment for the U.S. to engage with China at an important and challenging time in their relationship. And he said this could reduce the risk of miscalculations so that the two countries, quote, do not veer into potential conflict. And as for Beijing, it has urged the U.S. to take its interests into consideration and give up the illusion of dealing with China from a position of strength. Wang Wenbin, the spokesperson for the Chinese Foreign Ministries, had warned Washington that treating China as its main geopolitical challenge is a serious misjudgment. And the differences between the two sides have dimmed expectations for a major breakthrough at the meeting today.
Dong Shui reporting from Beijing. Well, let's get more now from our US correspondent, John Terretts in New York. So, John, what's the reaction been there in the United States to Blinken's visit?
Paul, good morning from New York. It's been one of the lead stories in the major agenda-setting Sunday broadcasts that go out on all the major networks here. It's been compared to the visit in 1971 by the then Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, who went in secret to set up a meeting which led to a get-together between then President Nixon and the paramount leader at the time, Deng Xiaoping, which eventually led to a complete change of status for China in the world, as it was regarded by other countries, and of course led to the beginning of the opening up of China that we've seen over the last 50 years or so. Diplomats say we are at the same tipping point right now. It is time that the rest of the world changed its view on China and its place in the world. Now, Antony Blinken has some key tasks ahead of him, and not to put too fine a point on it, one of them is to avoid any kind of conflict in the future over the issue of Taiwan. But more immediately, it is to open up communications. Now, do remember, throughout all of this last 5 or 6 years, at the lower diplomatic level, there have always been communications between Beijing and Washington, D.C., but not at the very, very highest level. And that is the key thing that Antony Blinken wants to try and change. He calls it empowered communication. He also has his eye on two major diplomatic events coming up, the G20 in New Delhi, India in September, and the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Leaders Summit in November in San Francisco. It is assumed by the State Department that President Xi may well attend both of those events, and therefore President Biden will meet him there. So one of the things that Blinken is doing is smoothing the way to make sure that any meeting later this year between President Biden and President Xi goes very smoothly. Now, it's not all sweet and rosy in the garden, because while this diplomatic initiative is going on in Beijing, later this week at the White House, they're pulling out all the stops with a lavish state visit for the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Now, the US and India sort of concerns and issues regarding China have converged in recent history. And as you know, New Delhi has issues with Beijing in the same way that DC has issues with Beijing. So there's a lot riding on Antony Blinken's trip. The background to it is to see China as a competitor, not something for which there will be conflict. As we heard from Dong Shui just now, Qin Gang, the foreign minister, met Antony Blinken late on Saturday night in Beijing when he arrived. They're all asleep there now, so they will pick up their diplomatic initiatives on Monday morning. Paul?
So, John, with talk of a tipping point and this concept of empowered communication, is a breakthrough expected?
No. In short, no. And that comes from the State Department and all China experts and analysts on this side of the Atlantic. And there's a reason for that. It's easy to understand when you know. Diplomacy takes time. You can't just fly into a capital city, click your fingers and make everything right. It simply doesn't work like that. And whilst we in television and most of the media want that to happen, that is not the way that it plays out. So I think if they can improve communications, just by being there, he's doing that. So if they can improve communications, and if they can pave the way for other very, very senior American political leaders like the Treasury Secretary and the Commerce Secretary and senior Chinese leaders to come over to the United States, then that will be seen as a victory. On Monday, we are told that Antony Blinken will meet the senior Chinese diplomat, Wang Yi. We're also told to look out for a meeting with President Xi. I don't think that's been confirmed, but it's certainly being reported here. And the region as a whole, the whole APAC region, is looking very closely at this because a lot of those countries have deep diplomatic ties with both countries, but are slightly warmer with Washington at the moment than they are with Beijing. And so they need a warmer relationship between DC and Beijing for them to improve their relationships with China as well. Just briefly, what divides them at the moment is trade, human rights, Taiwan, South China Sea and Cuba. What unites them, of course, is Ukraine, bringing peace there, climate change, health, the global economy. I don't think Blinken has been warmly welcomed there. It's a little bit frosty, that's my understanding. But I think if they can make progress and key to this, let the world know that they're at least on speaking terms, that'll be a victory.
John Terrett, thanks very much indeed for that.